Hi, welcome to my new video. In this video I'm gonna talk about Distrobox containers in terms of audio production, music production, etc. Because indifferent of the host system, the host operating system you are working with in your Linux environment, the container is of importance, and also what kind of factors do you have to consider during the creation of the containers? How do you utilize them? How do you configure user level settings, system level settings, especially the kernel or the close to kernel level settings? And in the description you can find some videos in which I've talked about Distrobox in general, audio plugins, production setup in general. Again, you can find it here, but this video will be more specific towards music production inside Distrobox containers indifferent of the host operating system. Let's go. The amount of freedom you possess in terms of configuring your systems, the real-time privileges, optimizing your memory, your CPU, etc. for performance, for real-time procedures, etc. is far more superior on Linux than it would be on Windows. Because of the amount of control over your operating system you do possess. And I mean, yes, there are some Linux distros pre-configured for you for music production, and the distro itself is not really that important. I mean, ignoring the fact that we are working inside Distrobox containers, which mostly annihilate the relevance, the importance of the distro you're installing packages onto. But in terms of optimizing your kernel, optimizing your CPU behavior, and having a packaged environment set up for your audio plugins, tools, etc. How are we proceeding? What do you need to possess in order to have the setup? In order to work with Distrobox, you need to install Podman, Docker or Lilliput. Maybe you have collected some experience on Windows with Docker, for example. Yeah, with VSL, Linux subsystems for Windows, maybe, but that's unimportant right now. In my case and in my tutorials, I only work with Podman. What is Podman? Podman is basically the containerization functionality inside a Linux environment itself. So that is the base fundamental of this entire setup here. Distrobox, on the other hand, is the containerization tool that relies upon Podman. Basically, it's a program which uses containerization, Podman in my case, to create a subsystem of Linux which is fundamentally integrated with your host system. I will explain that later on in the video. But to provide you a short recap, what's the difference between a virtual machine and a container? A virtual machine, you know, like VirtualBox, Virt Manager, etc., where you can install, you know, Kali Linux inside Fedora as a virtual machine, etc., are fundamentally separated. You are able to provide maybe some pass-throughs via shared folders, etc., but it only has limited access to your CPU, memory, and the GPU is an entire different setup. Maybe now single GPU pass-through, now I have dedicated GPU. This is not what the video is gonna be about. A container, on the other hand, like in my case, I have Arch Linux as the container on the NixOS system host. It does possess complete access to your CPU, your RAM, your SSDs, external drives, graphics card, etc. The only thing to look out for are NVIDIA GPU drivers, but I will explain that in a second. So basically, containers are just fundamentally intertwined with your host system, while virtual machines are locked in the basement. That's a weird analogy, but yeah, just roll with it. What are among other use cases you would have for containers? For example, I work with multiple different containers, and I have an Arch container dedicated for music production, for installing packages from the AUR or via Yardbridge Wine, and interacting with my host system, CPU, GPU, RAM, and so that I have a setup. For example, I could make this entire setup natively on NixOS, but not all packages are in the packaging system of each distro. NixOS in my case. So I wanted to have access to the AUR because in terms of audio production, audio plugins, equalizer, decent sampler, polygons, stretch, for example, the AUR is still superior than to the Nix packages. What other use cases would you have for working with containers? Are you working with proprietary software, for example, or programs that need specific packages and you do not want to clutter your host system with all of them so that it might create packaging conflicts or something like that? Because what am I trying to say is, if a package you have installed, for example, you have Fedora as your host system, Fedora 42, and onto which you install 42 Fedora container. Now you have twice the same thing, you might say. But in the container you can install the, let's just say, risky software, and if it breaks your system, or in that case just the container, you can just delete the container, create a new container, and you're good to go. Because if you would have installed that risky software on your host system, you might need to reboot and via live USB stick recover your system. So in that case, our container might have more than one benefit to you. Then you would also have the advantage of, broader bandwidth of compatibility. You have working on a Debian system or NixOS system, doesn't really matter. You want to have access to the AUR, for example. You want to install packages that are only supported in a Debian environment. You can do all that without, needing to install natively each distro on its own computer, because that would be stupid. Also, for example, you're working on a stable host system, maybe NixOS on a stable branch, for example, or Debian, it doesn't really matter. And you want to have the newest packages from the AUR on Arch-based systems, and without, running the risk of breaking your entire system. So you have access to the newest packages in a safe environment, for example. That is among many different ideas, the different concepts, the base idea of Distrobox. That is an oversimplification because Distrobox is way more than that. And the amount of tools you can do with that is also far greater than I have explained in my videos. But again, this video playlist is more, or this video channel is more focused about music production. And so I'm gonna focus more in that aspect. Another advantage you do have, before I continue, is that you work with some proprietary software, some outdated software, and that only supports, Fedora 37, for example, and you do not wanna, keep your entire host system on that low package version. You wanna upgrade it, of course, to Fedora 42. So you just create a container with that limited version, Fedora 37, for example, install a package in that container, and so it works flawlessly. So even with working with outdated packages, you have some leeway in that regard. These are all some tools and possibilities you do have in working with Distrobox. Now let's talk about the creation phase. Because again, in the video of description, I've shown you the terminal commands. So I've given you a showcase of how you set up your container in terms of terminal inputs. Now in this video, I'm gonna focus not on the actual showcases, but more the ideas behind it. So if you wanna have a tutorial to follow, first link in the video description. In this video, again, which you're currently viewing, I'm talking about multiple different concepts, but first of all, that is working with setting up NVIDIA drivers or NVIDIA container pass-through. That term doesn't really exist. I'm explaining in a second, and defining a unique home directive for your setup. And I will also explain why you should do this. If you're working with an AMD GPU, the containerization setup in GPU, on the GPU front, works without any issues. On NixOS, for example, I have first of all needed to install the NVIDIA toolkit. And secondly, I'm doing the creation phase, so Distrobox create, minus name, blah blah blah, minus image, blah blah blah, minus NVIDIA. Again, in the video of description, I've shown all of this. I needed to specifically define that I'm working with an NVIDIA GPU. So that's the entire setup works. So look out for that. I mean, on Fedora systems, for example, the NVIDIA toolkit is pre-installed, I think. So I never had any issues in that regard. Just something to look out for. And the most important part is working with a separate home directive. Because I think there might be some confusion on that front. I've said that the host system and the Distrobox container share the same home directive, meaning that, you know, the directive /home/ whichever username you have, so in my case is /home/Steve, and then in that folder there are pictures, your downloads, your documents, etc. That folder I'm talking about. And so these are shared by the host system and the container always, so that you can modify documents via an Arch container on a Debian host system, but that's beside the point. Now I've said you should specify a different home directive than your host home directive. Why should you do this? Because first of all, if you define a separate home directive for the container, it still has exact the amount of access to your host home directive without any issues, okay? It does not create complications in that regard, but it creates its own configuration files in a different folder than your host home folder. Why would this be important? Because if you're working with Wine, for example, or user level programs, and you just create, install Wine packages, etc., then in the home folder there's a .wine folder. It's a hidden folder by pressing Ctrl H or Steuerung H, depending on the language of your keyboard. You can just make the invisible folders visible, or back again if you would want to. And if you are specifying a unique home directive for the container, it will not overwrite your host configuration files. It will write its own configuration files in a different folder without creating data clash with your host system, which is quite essential on my system. Indifferent if you're working on a Fedora host system or NixOS host system, so that I'm able, for example, to work with two different Wine versions in parallel without any of them overriding the other. That is quite essential. Again, in the video description I've explained the entire setup by the terminal commands, just that you have a rough understanding of what I'm talking about. So now I've talked about, the entire setup of containers, so everything required you can do in containers. Each of the container, if you want to, with a different home directive, so that there's a data conflict in that regard. Okay, good and fine. That's unimportant right now. So you might think, okay, I just use an immutable Linux distro, Fedora Silverblue, Vanilla OS, or maybe even SteamOS maybe, and create an Arch container into which I've installed all my audio session plugins, Reaper.DAW or Ardour, it doesn't really matter, and then I'm good to go. And I will explain now why immutable Linux distros in that regard are more of a hindrance towards you. So I do not recommend working with immutable Linux distros. You can still, on a mutable Linux distro, create a minimal installation, but if you're working on Debian or a Fedora system, do not really worry about that. And you can still install Distrobox containers. Why is that essential? Now, I'm going to provide you an oversimplification, okay? I will jump over many details here, and if you're someone that has deep knowledge over Linux, close your ears, please, okay? On Linux, you are basically working on 3 levels. You are working in the user level, then on the system level, and then on the kernel-ish level. In my case, again, that's an oversimplification. What am I trying to say? The user level, installing packages, or so for example in the Arch container you can access the AUR without any issues, install the packages, the repo, etc. without any issues. But there are some things you need to put in consideration, especially the X-host packages, because in order for Distrobox container and the graphical packages inside a Distrobox container to work without any issues, you need to give the container X-host access. You need to configure on your host system, and then it's maybe called X-server or X-host access, basically to generate some pass-through in terms of GUI graphics rendering. I want to create an Arch Linux container and optimize it for music production. And so on the user level, let's just say, I can configure, my repo settings. I can install packages, tools, etc. without any issues. Now, the problems you might encounter, especially if you're working with an immutable Linux distro, which I do not recommend for that specific use case, is in terms of changing the kernel, setting up real-time privileges, setting up the CPU performance or behavior in general, the tuned program, for example. This is where immutable Linux distros already start to fall apart. Because in order for the audio session to work, you need to configure some things on your host system. Because the real-time privileges, the kernel settings, or the kernel itself, also the CPU behavior can only be modified on your host system. And thereby it's required to work on a host system which allows you to modify it. Now, depending on the distro you're using, because some have different names, etc. for the packages, that's unimportant. On Linux, for example, I had to install on NixOS the Zen kernel, basically overriding the stable kernel. The Zen kernel is optimized for gaming, video editing, also music production, and also generates some extra kernel tweaks. Again, you do not have to do this, installing the Zen kernel or the real-time kernel, depending on the distro you are using, but the Zen kernel is the kernel optimized, which can only be done on your host system. Then the real-time privileges, in order the audio plugins to work at the best and have the most amount of access to generate the least amount of latency, for example, and stability issues, you also need to configure that on your host system. And the CPU behavior. For example, if you want to switch the CPU behavior from power saving or balanced up to performance, you need to do this on your host system. And these are the things you really need to put in consideration in terms of working with Distrobox Podman containers in regards of audio production. I have already made a video about immutable Linux distros and why I personally dislike them in a desktop environment. In, for example, Steam Deck, for example, I'm not going to install any different Linux distro because, again, this immutable distro was made for the Steam Deck, it works flawless on that. Again, I'm saying immutable Linux distros, I don't really like them in terms of laptops or desktop PCs. That's my personal opinion. Again, what are your thoughts? What are your experience working with Distrobox containers in terms of music production? What problems did you had? And yeah, put it down in the description. I'm interested. And yeah, keep working because there's still much to do and go read berserk.